Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to the session of Society for Two Tasks. Um, Today we will be talking about the problem of evil, or the problem of pain, or the problem of suffering. This is a problem which has been much talked about, through the ages. And the title is sort of used interchangeably between evil, pain, and suffering, and the idea being that evil causes, pain and suffering. And we'll speak a little bit about that and the clarification of that in the slides to come. But this has been a strong reason for a lot of people to lose their faith, and this is usually one of the foremost arguments used by the new atheists, so to speak. This is the strongest weapon in their arsenal against theism, or their arguments against the existence of God. So today's attempt is going to be just to sort of break apart the problem, look at the logical parts, and see, how strong that argument really is, and if there are, sufficiently strong ways to respond to them, and so to speak. If you had a chance to look at the video in my email, you would see, how, because of the emotional punch that this problem can pack, atheists wield it with great power. But in a lot of that emotional talk, usually logic takes a back seat. So today we'll try to step a little back and first look at, how do we make sense of the problem, and what are the components of it. Sorry, I keep getting people to admit in the meeting. Okay, so having said that, just wanted to bring the problem itself into context. I'll start with the experience of Elie Wiesel, who has written a famous book and is a Nazi concentration camp survivor. And this very question, the question of the problem of evil, is posed in all its starkness by Elie Wiesel in his account of the hanging of two men and a young boy in Nazi concentration camp. Which he and all other prisoners were forced to witness. And this is an excerpt from his book called Night. This is his memoir. He says, "All eyes were on the child. Where is God? Where is he?" Someone behind me asked. The two adults were no longer alive, but the third rope was still moving. Being so light, the child was still alive. For more than half an hour, he stayed there, struggling between life and death, dying in slow agony under our eyes. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "Where is God now?" Now, this is not a new problem for us, as I mentioned before. And especially given the times that we are in, with a year-long pandemic going on, we all have experienced suffering. In fact, as the famous saying goes, the only certainties in life are death and taxes. So suffering is a part of everyone's life to certain greater or lesser extent. And in times of extreme suffering, is sometimes people turn to God, but a lot of times people turn away from God. So before getting swept off in the emotional arguments, let's take a 3,000, like a 10,000 feet view, and actually understand what the problem statement itself is. What are the atheists saying is the problem of evil, right? So usually it is framed like this: if God is all-knowing, which is omniscient, all-powerful, which is omnipotent, and all-good, which is omnibenevolent, how can evil or suffering or pain exist? So for the purpose of future future slides where I will be using these statements in proving logical contradictions, I'm naming these statements as A, which is the omni-God, as I'm abbreviating it. If God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, that's statement A. And statement B is evil existing, right? So these are the two statements. Keep this in mind as we use it further. And then, just as an aside, the field of theology, which deals with vindication of divine providence in the view of existence of evil, is Theodicy. This is an age-old field, and today we'll be understanding a little some of the arguments that are used in this field. Now, upfront, when we look at the slide, it's easy to understand that a quick way to subvert this problem is just to admit that, okay, God is either not all-knowing or not all-powerful or not all good or some combination of the three, and then you subvert the problem. While that's a some religions actually do that. Like some mythological religions do not claim God to be omni-God, but we will argue from a standpoint of classical theism. So we'll hold to these, these omni attributes of God, right? Um, Sorry, one sec. Yeah. So let's first demystify the statement A, all the components of the statement A, which is to say the definition of an omni-God, right? So the first omniness was the omnibenevolence, or God being all good. Now, a lot of times we understand, or atheists tend to frame God's goodness or misjudge it as merely kindness. But goodness is inherently more than that. And this is put beautifully by C.S. Lewis, as he usually does, in this quote, where he articulates that we want, in fact, not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, a senile benevolence who, as they say, like to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. Now, this rings at the truth of the fact that the purpose of creation not merely to have a good time. We often hear this in pluralistic cultures where people say, I'm good, I'm living a good life since I'm not harming anyone. Or another way of putting it is the most kind you can be, you probably never interact with anyone, right? There's a lot of emphasis on good vibes or positive vibes, and that sells today in today's entertainment and media world. And we somehow tend to attribute that logic of good to God also. But like I said, clearly there is more purpose to life than just having a good time, as articulated with this fact. So then, if we talk about goodness, and if we say that it's relative, that it lies in the eye of the beholder, then there is no absolute ground to decry bad or evil, right? So if you put a platter of pastries and fruits in front of a child and ask him what is good, the child is going to choose the pastries. I mean, most children are, but from an objective standpoint, maybe the fruits are better for the kid, right? So what that means is, and this is a silly analogy to sort of drive home the point, that a strong collective sense of good or justice posits an absolute standard giver or an absolute lawgiver. And this needs to be held consistently by atheists as well. Um, Surprisingly, one of the foremost atheists of our generation, Richard Dawkins, has said this line. I don't know if this is proof texting, but it seems like it's from one of his books. Maybe he was just conceding this point, but he says that the moral law is a reason to think of God as plausible, not just a God who sets the universe in motion, but a God who cares about human beings, because we seem uniquely amongst creatures on the planet to have this far developed sense of morality. So having understood this, absolute standard of a moral lawgiver, we can also then look at other aspects of what all good means. Now, all good is sometimes interchangeably used with all loving, right? But a loving God can allow for necessary or reasonable pain. Now, what do we mean by that? And is pain always bad? Now, we all have we all know that for growth, pain is necessary. Now, be that for elevation or alleviation of certain medical maladies, like you go to a dentist, there's a certain bit of temporary pain, but that enhanced wellness comes after that. If you're in a gym, you know that you need to work your muscles towards pain and failure to be able to grow. Even loving mothers will often vaccinate their children at the cost of certain temporary pain. So that tells us that pain can sometimes be necessary and reasonable. And pain, we also intuitively understand that from an evolutionary standpoint is sort of important, because pain tells us that something is wrong. So pain cannot be quickly clumped together as completely unnecessary. But not only from an not only from an evolutionary or a physical standpoint, even from a spiritual and emotional standpoint, we understand that pain is important, because pain tells us that there is something wrong, maybe in our relationships, or maybe in the state of the world. So in that sense, pain is a good indicator of your surroundings. And again, I think C.S. Lewis puts it best when he quotes saying, God whispers in our pleasure, but screams in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So that is about all good, which is omnibenevolence of God. Next, let us look at omnipotence. What do people usually mean when they say God is all-powerful? Now, one thing to understand is that all-powerful does not imply ability to create logical contradictions. So, to make an extreme point, if we ask questions like, well, can God create a boulder which he cannot lift? Or maybe he can create that boulder, but if he can't lift that boulder, then God is not all-powerful. So this is not limiting the powers of God, but it is actually only positing a meaningless or an absurd question. Similarly, can God create a square circle, or can God create a married bachelor? Well, the last one, I think some people can do it themselves, but typically understanding, God wouldn't do such logical contradictions. And that is something we need to clearly understand and differentiate when we're talking about God being all powerful. Because if the answer to any of these is yes, then the proposition of a good God creating evil is also not problematic, right? Because if God can create contradictions, then we shouldn't be surprised that evil also coexists. So the problem itself dissolves. Next, let's look at omniscience. One thing to understand about an all-knowing God is that it is difficult for us to understand or grasp complete knowledge. Omniscience cannot be communicated to finite beings. Now, why is this? There are two dimensions or aspects to understanding this problem. Because usually all-knowing is used in the context of, well, God knows there is suffering. God knows what is happening everywhere in the world. But there is more to that, right? God also knows what has happened in the past and possibly what is going to happen in the future. Some sort of like all-knowing, all-pervasive omniscience, right? And if we think about it from that perspective, by definition, because we are temporal beings and we have limited contextual understanding, we probably will not be able to judge God's omniscience, like whether or not, how much he knows and whether or not his judgment is correct. Now, to give again a silly analogy, I'm assuming in contemporary times, everyone is familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, this is a long saga of, first of its kind, of like 22 movies, which are in entirety telling one story, but each movie is a standalone story as well. So if, let's say, you started watching this series from movie number 10 or whatever, you just started from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, you would still probably understand what's going on in the movie. That's from your standpoint, but you will not have full context of what's going on in the universe. So if you saw all of the movies, you'd probably understand more. But the other problem is you would never know what's going to happen in the future movies. So from a temporal standpoint, we might have the benefit of the past. We won't have complete benefit of the past. And whatever we feel we know... Sorry, did someone have a question? Okay, sorry. So we would not have complete context of what happened in the past, and temporally we would only know in detail what is happening in the present. So it's difficult for us to understand. For those of us who are not into Marvel Cinematic Universe,
are we in the end game now?
Well, we are in phase 5 now. It's still going on. Yeah. Yeah. So for those who are not familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you can also think of it as, let's say a Lord of the Rings trilogy, or a like a saga or a book where someone just, suddenly finds like a few torn pages here and there. They might understand that particular chapter, but they would not appreciate what's happening in such a big saga, right? So that's the context. And second is, the second problem of omniscience is that is the ability, is our capacity to understand. Now, the best way to probably analogize this is if you have had the experience of taking a pet to a vet. Now, I think some pets are okay, but like usually small puppies would be terrified of the vet. Now that you're taking the puppy for shots because it's good for the puppy. The puppy has no way of grasping that. You can communicate to the puppy, you can show up, you can also call it by name. So it's not that there is no communication channel at all, but there is no way that the puppy's consciousness can expand enough that you can explain to them that this is going to be good for them in the future. And if we think about hierarchy of beings, an omniscient being trying to communicate to us would also be the same way. There would be some channels of communication open, but there would be limitation on how much can be communicated. So, to summarize what we learned about, the components of statement A. Statement A was God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Summarize some of the assumptions, or to peel away some of the assumptions. I have like 6 statements which we might need to remember for future. So proposition 1 is, in order to be able to appeal to universally agreed standards of goodness or justice, it should be defined by a higher authority or a moral lawgiver. Pain can be useful and necessary in some contexts. Love can permit necessary and reasonable pain. There is a limit to knowledge that can be communicated to finite beings. And hence it is understandable that humans are evidently not the best authority of what is good or what is reasonable pain, especially when looking into the future. And then finally, omnipotence does not imply the ability to create logical contradictions. Having said this, let's take a quick look at understanding evil, because that is statement B. We all understand evil, to cause suffering, and I think that the very definition of the word itself is not confusing. But let's look at some dimensions which we might miss sometimes. The first of that is understanding evil as a privation or a corruption that exists in something that was originally good and perfect. So this was put forward by Augustine, and this was refuted heavily by atheists of the time. But this is an important. This is a useful aspect to understand about evil, is that evil is essentially a privation or a deprivation of good, which is to say that it is sort of, to analogize, it is like cold is the absence of heat, while it is also the opposite of heat. It is in a way the absence of heat. So if heat is not present, things would be sort of cool. And that's the way to think about good in terms of how God created it, that God created good. But because of the fall, man went away from that good, and that is the presence of evil, right? So this is the way I think Augustine first brought in the whole, the fall theodicy. Like the human beings have all of the suffering exists because of fall, which is familiar to Christians. Now a note I had on this, on this concept, is that when atheists use a privation of an entity, is being used as the primary and sole arguments against the existence of its source, I don't think it's a strong argument. In fact, it can rather only support, this sort of arguments can only support other ontological arguments and forms of investigation. Now, this is quite a mouthful, and it's probably not very well articulated by me. So let me try to explain what I mean. I'm saying that the lack of something cannot be the primary argument against the source of its lack. So, for example, let's say if a kid understands that if they're good, that in their worldly context, if they're good, then Santa Claus comes and gives them gifts. Let's say if a kid was good and did not get gifts this Christmas, the kid can conclude that Santa Claus does not exist, and it's probably true that Santa Claus does not exist. But the kid's reasoning was not the best way to prove that Santa Claus does not exist. There are like way too many other logical reasons we can use to arrive at the fact that Santa Claus does not exist, and those should take precedence, not the fact that there was no gifts. And it is the same way with evil. The privation of good cannot be used as a primary argument. So this is just a side point we'll use again when we go forward. And then another thing to understand about evil is that it is we mentioned this before, it's a source of all suffering, and that's why we are clubbing it with the problem of pain or suffering. But it can be broadly classified into two types. So there is suffering which is caused by human agency, and then there is suffering which is caused without human agency. So suffering caused by human agency could include, crime, murder, wars, things like terrorism, slavery, abuse. All of this would be clubbed under moral evil. And then, other sufferings like, just plain death or natural disasters like tsunamis or earthquakes, volcanoes, cyclones. These are obviously not caused by human agency, and hence they are all clubbed under natural evil. Now, majority of all evil in the world, would fall under moral evil, and bifurcating it evil this way or suffering this way, it makes it very easy to address a huge chunk of the problem of evil. And why is that? It is because most of the moral evil exists in a universe or in a world where free wills of souls collide. Which is to say that, according to, going back to Augustinian Theodicy, free will was given to man by God. And we know now that, we argued now that God doesn't do logical contradiction. So giving free will means that God does not control people's actions, which, unless you're a Calvinist, you would have to agree. If you are a Calvinist, then you need to book a session with Finney and let him convince you otherwise. But for the interest of time, and actually, even if you are a Calvinist, this can be used in a logical argument, and I'll show how. But what that means is God gives human beings free will, and when free wills collide, when people want different things, there is bound to be suffering in the world, because some will lose and some will gain. Now, this was put most brilliantly in classic Chestertonian fashion, when in the early 1900s, the Times of London, sent out a request to all the popular writers at that point in time, asking them to give an essay answering the question, what is wrong with the world today? And Chesterton, in true to his style, replied with one line saying, "Dear sir, I am." And that goes to show very pithily that free will is a necessary consequence. Evil is a necessary consequence of free will, even though free will is a manifestation of God's love. And that is something that can explain away most of the evil in the world without having to necessarily dispute the existence of evil. It still does leave the natural evil part of the equation. That is slightly more difficult to explain. But at this point, I would also want to mention a few other theodicies which people have sort of posited over the years, which are not very strong, but just wanted to make a small mention of here. So another theodicy which was proposed by Irenaeus and then supported by John Hick later was called the soul-making theodicy, which is to say that all pain is for necessarily for the growth of souls and to make them more perfect in God's eyes. Because if, as we mentioned, good is defined according to the purpose of the Creator, and then God can use pain to take human beings to that purpose, and that would be the definition of good. And then there is also process theodicy, where it is posited that God doesn't interfere. God creates good and permits evil and doesn't interfere directly in it. They are a little bit more ambiguous to explain. A better way to actually address this problem or address this problem more holistically is to break down the problem of evil. So when I say holistically, I'm saying without having to bifurcate between moral and natural evil. If you just look at evil and the problem of evil and break it down into its components parts, can we answer it on first principles basis? Now let's take a look at that. So the problem of evil itself can be broken down into the intellectual problem and the emotional problem, which is to say some people make the stand that it is irrational for God to permit suffering and evil, whereas some people merely say, I don't like a God who permits suffering and evil. Now you notice that in the emotional problem, the underlying concession is that God exists, I just don't like that God. And if you watch the Stephen Fry or most atheists, when they use strong language or strong rhetoric against God, it's always coming from a standpoint that God exists, we just don't like the kind of God that exists, right? And then the intellectual problem itself can be broken down into two parts. One is the logical problem and then the evidential problem. So the logical problem necessarily states that it is impossible for God and evil to exist. Whereas the evidential problem says, well, looking at everything around us, it is improbable for God and evil to coexist, right? So we need to answer the logical problem, the evidential problem, and the emotional problem. As we'll see, because logical problems takes a hard stance of impossibility, it's easier to refute. Improbability is more subjective and hence a little bit more difficult to refute. An emotional problem is a different realm altogether, right? And it's difficult to refute. It's difficult to answer. And actually, it falls in the realm of pastoral care rather than apologetics. Because usually when the person is coming from that standpoint, that I don't like a God who permits suffering and evil, it's due to some personal turmoil and they're not looking for a rational explanation. So at that point in time, the format of the answer needs to be more empathetic, and we'll take a look at how that can be addressed as well. So then let's tackle this one at a time. Let's go to the logical problem, and here is where we can make the strongest case against any proof of non-existence of God. So if you remember statement A and B, statement A said all-powerful, the omni God, all-powerful, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. If God is all of that, that is statement A. And statement B is evil existing, suffering existing, or pain existing. On the face of it, there is actually no logical contradiction between these two statements, right? There are certain underlying assumptions or unstated assumptions that atheists have, which make for these two statements to be contradictory. And those assumptions are that one, an all-powerful God can create any world he wants, and two, an all-loving God will always prefer a world without suffering. Now, if you remember statements P1 to P6, we've already proved that statements such as all-powerful God can create any world he wants is not completely correct. And also statements like all-loving God will always prefer a world without suffering is not completely correct, because sometimes God can choose sufferings for moral reasons, right? So we invalidate those assumptions, and hence the argument itself falls away, that there is no contradiction between statement A and B. But even without trying to debunk those assumptions, we can formulate a statement C which can prove that A and B are consistent. So God can be all good and all powerful, yet he cannot create a world which has as much good but less suffering as the actual one. And God has morally sufficient reason to permit the suffering that exists. If in this eventuality, an omni God and evil coexisting, there is no logical inconsistency in these two statements. So in that sense, we are able to sort of address on first principles the logical problem of evil. Now let's go to the evidential problem of evil. Now this is a probabilistic argument, which is to say that evidence. What does the evidence suggest? Like, is it probable? If A is true, is B probable? Like, that is to say, if there is an omni God, is it probable that evil would exist, or God would allow suffering? Right. The way to answer this question is by acknowledging our limitedness in answering this question, right? So if you look at 2, human limitedness says that by our finite and temporal nature, we are not best suited to judge the improbability of whether God has good reasons to permit suffering. And hence, the question itself becomes a little bit not impertinent, but it sort of not completely uh, logical to ask. But on the other hand, we also have to look at the strength of relative evidence, not just the presence of evil, but the evidence of good, of the truth and beauty in the world, along with other well-developed religious doctrines of religious doctrines of faith, would actually tip the balance against the question of improbability. We would say that because of all these other evidences, it is actually probable that a God exists and he has good moral cause for suffering, to allow suffering. So that is the way we can address the evidential problem of evil. Now, before we go to the emotional problem of evil, let's actually look at let's examine the atheist position. There could be various chinks in the armor of atheism that we can poke at, but there are 3 that stand out when we examine this problem. One is the imperfect definition of God that atheists tend to propound, and we've seen some of that in debunking the omni nature of God and what the underlying assumptions are. So usually there is this strawman concept of building up a God who's mean and then shooting down that God, rather than saying, well, is God just one among many beings, like you would talk about a Greek God, or is he ipsum esse subsistens, as like Thomas Aquinas would put, like basically is God more than just a being, but like the essence of being itself, right? And this has come up with popular theologians like N.T. Wright. When he, in his chaplain days, I think a student came up to him in one of his sessions and told him, hey, I just want to attend, but you won't see a lot of me because I don't believe in God and stuff like that. So N.T. Wright asked him, well, what do you mean by God? Like, what do you understand by God? And the student went on to explain what he thinks of God. And then N.T. Wright simply said, well, yes, I agree with you. I don't believe in that God either. And a lot of popular theologians like Herbert McCabe have let atheists first define their God and then agreed with them and said that, well, no, if that is what you think of God, then I agree with you. That God does not exist. So that imperfect definition of God is a big chink in the armor of atheist position. Second is the burden of proof. So atheists usually rely on the fact that the burden of proof lies on theists, which is to say, the whole argument of lack of evidence is not the evidence of lack, but they usually cannot prove that God doesn't exist. They only say that if we don't reasonably know, then he probably doesn't exist. That apart, in this particular case, in the problem of evil, they're using privation as a primary argument and putting the onus on the theists. We spoke a little bit about that, using privation of good as a primary ontological argument. There is some difficulty in that. But the biggest problem in the atheist position is the justification for their outrage, right? So if, let's say, God does not exist, then by simply following the law of nature, which includes natural disasters, death, and survival of the fittest, or whatever, one should not protest against injustice and suffering, because that's just the way nature is. Now, atheists tend to inconsistently apply the problem of evil to say that it is only a problem if God exists. It is not a problem if God does not exist, which is inconsistent. A problem is a problem because it's a problem for human beings. So that that exists irrespective of whether or not God exists. What that points to is it's saying that you're not having a problem with existence of God. You're having a problem with the nature of God, or the God in your mind. So it's an emotional problem that you're talking about if you say that injustice is a problem. And that brings us to the to the next part of the presentation, where atheists simply cannot address the emotional problem of evil. Like what would an atheist tell a person who is bereaved or going through some suffering in life, right? So there isn't that really a strong argument for them to really console someone who's down. And as I mentioned, emotional problem of evil does not lend itself well to logical arguments. So a good way to look at how to cater to this problem, specifically in the context of suffering people, is maybe to look at it through the lens of major world religions. So what do world religions have to offer their devotees or their disciples in terms of, especially to people who ask this question? And this is a question which has gone on since since the start of ages, right? So let's first take a look at Hinduism. Now, Hinduism explains suffering without really focusing on God, because it is at its heart a pantheistic, it is at its heart a pantheistic philosophy, and it does not necessarily posit an omni God. So if you remember one of the first slides where we stated the problem, we said that this problem dissolves if we just admit that God is not omnipotent, omniscient, or omnibenevolent. And Hinduism sort of takes that approach. Second is they have a strong concept of karma. What that means is a person's present suffering is a result of his karma or actions from the previous birth, and his station in the next birth will be decided by karma in the present one. This could be one way of explaining suffering. But on the other hand, this whole concept of birth and station in life leads to a lot of societal conflict, like casteism, which is prevalent in India. Just a quick note: none of these religions I'll be able to expound too much, because obviously these are all like major world religions, and I'm not an expert. Just wanted to give like a quick snapshot of what they talk about. But Hinduism specifically talks about, while it addresses the problem of suffering, it appeals to something beyond this world. So what it says is, it has the concept of Maya, where it says as this entire experience of life as we know it, and even of rebirth, is just an illusionary cycle that human beings are stuck inside. And the whole purpose of, or the ultimate purpose is moksha, or is to break free of the Maya or illusion and gain oneness with the universal soul or the universal Brahman. That's the way Hinduism explains this. And then they also focus on the practical aspects or the practical tips for elevation of worldly suffering, including renunciation of sense objects, yoga, controlling the breath, dispassion, controlling emotions, and all those kind of things, right? Next, let's look at Buddhism, which also focuses on elevation of suffering rather than on God itself, because it's an offshoot of Hinduism, and it has similar beliefs about karma, rebirth, and an omni God, or the lack of an omni God. For context, Gautama Buddha was born into a Hindu royal family and left from there specifically because of the problem of suffering. So the problem of suffering and pain is central to Buddhism. And Buddha's sort of highest theological or philosophical achievement was that of nirvana, the Buddhist ideal of enlightenment, which in a way is similar to moksha. Now, Buddhism is, like I said, is very specific and catered to elevation of suffering. So Buddha concentrated on elevation of suffering in self, not necessarily in others. The focus was on oneself, using the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are that dukkha, or suffering, is an innate characteristic of existence in the samsara, or this world. Samudaya, or the origin of this dukkha or suffering, is from tanha, which is the craving or desire or attachment to any sense object. And then nirodha, which is the cessation of this dukkha, can be attained by renouncing this attachment or craving. And magga, or the eightfold path, leads to renouncement of I think it's tanha and cessation of dukkha, not magga. That's a mistake. So magga leads to the renouncement of tanha, which is a craving, and it leads to the cessation of dukkha, which is suffering. And then the eightfold path, which is the magga, it consists of right view, right resolve, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right mindfulness, and right samadhi, or meditative assumption. A lot of people find this useful, and a lot of the mindfulness techniques, etc., helps people elevate suffering within oneself, not so much suffering in others. But again, I think some part of the problem is when we talk about right view, right resolve, right speech, it still becomes relativistic. Next, we move on to Islam, and Islam shares an Abrahamic tradition, as we all know, and hence its response to evil and suffering would be, there might be some overlap with Christianity and Judaism. Uh, Islam, of course, has a strong focus on Quranic revelation, and that's the fundamental difference between Islam and Christianity. The Quran being the God's word, being Allah's word, and hence it sort of mandates a complete faith in Allah's judgment. Quran, like Christianity and Judaism, affirms the fall, and that's a big part of the explanation of evil and suffering. And it also affirms eternal life, which is a big part of the explanation of how evil and suffering will be elevated in the next life. And while acknowledgement of suffering, exists in the Quran as well, because items like the Book of Job or the story of Job is in the Quran. It is usually contextualized with a strong appeal to Allah understanding, which is to say that Allah understands what needs to be done at this point in time, and there is always a reason. And there is always an emphasis on the balance of suffering in this life with rewards in the next life. And so that is a core characteristic of Islamic belief or Islamic response to the problem of evil and suffering. Now that, of course, brings us to Christianity. A lot of the views on theodicy and philosophy was obviously borrowed from Christianity, and there are tomes of theology on all these kind of subjects, especially on the topic of suffering. So I won't expound much because that would be A, not possible, but B, also maybe repetitive. But there is one aspect specifically of our scriptural our scriptural history that is very interesting, and I wanted to sort of maybe harp on that point for today. Now, if you look at this drawing, this is called one of the visual paradoxes. It's called as the Drawing Hands by M.C. Escher. Now, this drawing, is sort of two hands drawing each other, and sometimes these visual paradoxes are helpful for us to sort of have categories under which we can think about things. So in this case, it's not clear which hand is drawing which or which hand came first, but it exists. The drawing itself exists. And the point of the paradox is to say that some things in life or some things in the world can be so complex and interlinked that it might be difficult for us to say which came first or what is the cause and all those kind of things, right? A silly example would be which came first, chicken or egg, or even like do you first fall in love with someone and then have your brain chemistry change, or all those things happen, or that happens first and hence you fall in love with someone, all those kind of questions, right? This question at its peak was Christianity had to debate was, well, is Jesus human or is Jesus divine? And the understanding was, well, it's both. It's both and at the same time. And so it's helpful to have that category of things to think, the category to think under. And I want to submit that the Bible also, or the history of the writing of the Bible also falls under this category, because Bible clearly claims to be divinely inspired, and yet it is unabashedly accepted that everything in the Bible is written by human beings. Now it is both and, very different from the Quranic tradition, which says that it is God's revealed word. It is all inspired by God, but it is all written by human beings, and it's both and. Now, what's unique about the Bible in that respect is that it is perhaps the only book where human beings are writing under divine inspiration about how to lament their suffering and how to respond to their suffering in prayer. And that is the book of Psalms. Now here is God inspiring humans to understand and pray, for their own about their own suffering to God, and giving them a vocabulary to do it. So if we turn to Psalm 22, first off, we notice that there is a cliff note on top of the psalm which says, "To the chief musician, set to the deer of the dawn, a psalm of David." What this tells us that we know this is a psalm written by David, who, just to put in context, came around 1,000 years before Jesus Christ. So this was written by him, and it was set to the tune of a song called "The Deer of Dawn," "Deer of the Dawn," which, I mean, you and I probably don't know. I actually don't know if this is a famous song, but what that means is this was notes to the chief musician to tell him or her um, that this is the tune to which to play the song. This indicates that for 1,000 years, uh, this song and this psalm was embedded in the Jewish culture. They used it, they had a certain way of singing it, and it was part of their culture of lament. And then 1,000 years down the line, when Jesus finally went to the cross, these are the words he chose to say. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, what this points to is that God's response to human suffering and to redeem human suffering was for God to suffer as human being, which is that God partook in our suffering. Now, in my mind, and this is refutable in some sense because it's subjective, but even from a psychological standpoint, the best response to suffering is empathy. If you've had the chance to, to console someone bereaved about the loss of a loved one or anything like that, you know that it's not possible to solve their problem. But what they need at that point is your understanding and your empathy and your willingness to suffer with them. And because the Bible is written in this way, it is clear to mythologians or people who read mythology that it is not myth. It is not written in a way, usually in myths, the god or the hero will conquer the evil. Here, the god subverted evil by succumbing to it. Now, this brings us to an interesting point, which is to say that a loving God can redeem good from evil. So yes, we have to concede that God created the world, he gave free will, and in that way he permits evil. But is evil irredeemably terrible? Can it be redeemed? And that is where I feel the omnipotence of God shines through, is that he can redeem good from evil. And that's why, possibly the worst injustice in the history of human beings would be, crucifying a person who came down with only to preach love, only to heal people, and heal the sick and afflicted. And he was crucified without cause and killed. Now that, to all our sensibilities of justice and evil, is evil. But we still call it Good Friday because something out of it. Right? And hence it is possible, it's probable to understand that God permits evil to draw out good. And in doing that, Jesus also gave the ultimate answer for suffering. And that ultimate answer is a call to take up your cross and love your neighbor as yourself. And that is what God posits in terms of an answer to suffering in the human world. It's not a disinterested God, it's not a cruel God, but it's a God who provides a definitive answer. And shows it by example of a loving, shows it by his own loving example. And then, we can close by harkening back to Elie Wiesel's quotation from the start, to the response of, the dying child on the gallows in the concentration camp. The words that were said were, "Behind me, I heard the same man asking, 'Where is God now?' And I heard a voice within me answer him, 'Where is he? Here he is. He's hanging here on this gallows.'" With that, that's all I had to share. Maybe it was a little bit over time. Happy to open up any questions, but also just hear your reactions. What if this sounded, convincing? If you heard better arguments, or where these arguments fall short, or your personal experiences talking or engaging with atheists on these questions. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Jaison. That was an excellent talk covered a lot of ground here. I'm going to make one quick announcement, and then let's have a time of Q&A. I think we can have some very rich Q&A based on this. So we have 4 societies left for the year, and then we'll take our break for the summer. Just to let everybody know, for next week, we have a guest speaker who his expertise is in he's a Roman Catholic. He's a Catholic priest. His expertise is in in bioethics, and the subject is going to be on the ethics of using fetal cells in vaccines. That's been a topic of discussion recently. And he also has a PhD in biology, so probably as well from MIT. So very well qualified person to speak on the subject. I hope you can join, and I'm looking forward to moderating that. With that, let's have a time of questions here. Jaison, I thought you did a very good job covering a huge amount of terrain in a short period of time. I have 4 or 5 questions here. I'll start with just one, and would love to get your response, and then I'll put it up to others. If there's not other questions, I'll keep asking. The first question that I have is, you did a really nice job articulating the omnis there, and you said that you were going to go down the path of assuming all of the omnis were true, rather than, as you pointed out, you delete one of those, it becomes a much easier problem to address. The one that I think is the trickiest of the omnis is the omnipotence one, because it feels to me like when you read the scriptural pattern that God has meaningfully delegated his power to humans, and that there's a real, not a fake transfer, but a real transfer of power that he has given to humans. And so I think we can say in some sense, yes, God is ultimately all powerful, but it doesn't feel like that is a very accurate representation of the God of the Bible. And when we relax at least that strict statement there, it becomes a huge help for understanding the problem of evil, where it suddenly falls much more on our shoulders. And Jeff, I think, was the one who pointed out that even a lot of the natural evils that you showed there probably have a human cause. Not all of them, but many of them have that. Doesn't that solve a lot of our issues, or do you think that that's flawed reasoning?
So I'd respond in 2 ways. So one, does it solve a lot of our issues? Yes. So for example, if out of 100% of our issues, it might increase. Let's say with free will we were explaining 80% of the evil. If we include this, that some problems, even some natural evil, is caused by human agency, then it probably expands it to like 95%. Still leaves a little bit unexplained. But I think I wouldn't refute your point or your argument. But I think maybe I didn't do a good job of articulating this or contextualizing this. But I did not want to start the presentation under a Christian God assumption. I wanted to leave it at a
Right.
just theism versus atheism sort of assumption, and then slowly. I mean, it's sort of not possible to completely leave out Christian theology, because a lot of the work on this field is done by historically Christian theologians. But as far as possible, I wanted to keep it at a religion agnostic level. Yeah, if that makes sense.
It does. There is I'll see if others have questions here.
Quick question: do we record the question answer
I
session?
think we should. I think we should, and I would like to put this all on YouTube. So if we could keep it on, that would be great.
So I have a question regarding natural evil. I feel like everything else, I think we can make a case for. Natural evil, even though you say it's just maybe 5%, that's still a lot. I was reading like a book on Christian history the other day, and talks about Voltaire, and during the Enlightenment, he wrote a poem on the disaster of Lisbon, right, which is the capital city of Portugal. There was an earthquake during All Saints' Day at 1755. A lot of people were in church at the time, celebrating the holiday, and an earthquake happened right off the coast, and tens of thousands of people just died as the churches and all the buildings collapsed. People were buried under the rubble, children, adults alike. It's just an earthquake. And sometimes I feel like, I get it, right? Like Holocaust, a lot of these horrible things, God gave us the freedom, and people choose to do evil. But things like earthquake, it's like people don't know any better. They just build houses, and the technology isn't there. Like, what do you think about that? And that's just Western history, right? I mean, if you look at China, like during there are earthquakes in the past in the Gansu province, the Yellow Plateau, the Yellow Earth Plateau, A lot of people dug caves in there to living there because it's cheap and easy to living. But when earthquake come, people are just buried alive in there. And tens of thousands of people, millions of people in the history of humanity has died and suffered from that. Like, what gives, right?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Fred. So on an emotional level, or on a psychological level, this question is sort of difficult to answer. It's in terms of, what can you explain why God did it, right? So we have to sort of mentally separate that question as, well, does this prove that God does not exist? Limited. That's the limited answer I've been trying to give in this presentation. So separate out. Oh, does this prove that God does not exist conclusively? And then the second part of it is, well, why did God do, like? How does this make sense? How can we make sense? So the first part is using all the arguments. But is it probable? Does it mean, like, can it not be redeemed? What about afterlife? This life is temporary. What about the fall? Because human beings show certain free will. Like, in the earth itself fell, like, not just the spiritual domain, but like the Garden of Eden, like, gone away, and then sort of a fallen creation. That's what Augustine argued, and hence a lot of natural evil as well. So all of that can sort of address the question of, well, yes, that can exist, and still God can exist. I think your question is more of, well, how do we explain this? Like, how do we explain the nature of God given all of this misery? For that, I don't. I mean, that was not the subject of my presentation. I don't have convincing answers, and the reason I don't is because of the problem of communication of the all-knowing or the omniscient nature of God to human beings. I feel like even if God wanted to explain it to us, we probably can't grasp it because we don't have the context, and it's below our capacity. So that's the only I think strong argument I can give you as to why we don't have an answer. But I'd also like to throw it open to others on the call if anyone else has heard of better better answers to that question.
Yeah, adding on to Jason, one argument that I've heard in relation to addressing the issue of natural evil is that it's a consequence of God giving us natural laws. So, like, the way to think about it is similar to how one would address moral evil, right? God gave humans free will, and out of that came moral evil. But if God gave us natural laws, and if processes that we have in the universe and on Earth follow these natural laws, then natural evil inevitably also falls out from that. So that's just one thought I wanted to pitch out.
Yeah. And then to add to that, I think that's a great question from Fred. And yeah, to add to that also too is that, like, there's some like man-made aspect to natural evil as well, right? Whether it be like the way we take care of our environment, the way we, like, for example, like certain like floods, for example, right? Yeah, there are like some of them are like pure natural, but like certain natural disasters, there's like some man-made aspect to it as well. So that's like another argument that I've heard as well used for.
Yeah. Thanks, Juan, and thanks to Wang and James. I think one thing I'd like to add there, James, which I probably did not mention, is that there's also this concept of that the earthquake doesn't make sense. A lot of people lost their lives. So what was the purpose of that, and all those kind of things? But even the purpose of creation and the ultimate goal for humans, we cannot postulate on that, if it makes sense. Like, the ultimate goal of creating human beings could not, for this life, might not have been that they should just live forever. I mean, that is anyways, postulated in the next life, and that's the eternal life, and that's like the perfection of the soul, right? So the fact that a lot of people died, while it seems like a little bit of injustice, and that points to an afterlife where that will not happen, but it might be in overall, it might be within the purpose of the creator. So it's tricky for us to judge that that's bad in and of itself. Again, it's not a very emotionally convincing argument, but that's probably the other point that I want to go to Brenda, because I see that you've been raising a hand for a while. Brenda, if you wanted to ask a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I came in late, so you may have addressed this before I came on, but to me, it seems that whether or not you start from a premise of a Christian God or just an agnostic premise, if people can agree that that an inherent quality of genuine love is non-coercive, then it logically requires that genuine love actually requires the possibility of pain. Um, and not just allows for it, because there needs to be a choice involved. And people have been in the last couple responses talking about choice as an explanation for some of the negative things. And on the issue of natural evil, I think that one of the things that is easy to forget is that we only know about the natural disasters, or we only really pay attention to the ones that have major impact and negative impact. We don't as well chronicle the ones that have surprisingly little impact. They don't cause nearly the amount of destruction or death as we thought they would or recognize they could have. It's the ones that do have the major catastrophic effects that rightfully get a lot of attention. But I think there's not always a balance, and there's even some presumption that we are aware of all of the different natural things that happen, and so we can judge the existence of God based on what we know, and our ability to know those things is finite. So those are my thoughts.
And this is exactly, basically what the book of Job, which is used as a classical text for answering the problem of suffering, essentially says, right? Where God asks, where were you when I created, the ends of the earth and the Leviathan and the... Yeah, so thanks, Brenda. That's a very strong point. And even your first point about, love necessarily positing a choice and the possibility of suffering. I don't think I brought that out explicitly. It was implicit in my presentations, but yeah, thanks for bringing that one out as well.
Can I add one other really quick point to that answer, which I see Billy has his hand up too. We should go to him next, but just because it's on the same topic. One of the other really interesting ideas behind natural evil is the influence of the demonic or the satanic. And there's a very interesting passage in Luke where Jesus is speaking in reference to a woman who has some kind of spinal deformity. And this would fall into the category of natural evil, would be cancer in children and tsunamis, all these things. And Jesus makes the comment when he's challenged, should not this woman whom Satan has bound be not loosed on the Sabbath? He's accused of wrongfully healing there. And so we have a very clear statement by Jesus that, at least in this instance, that there is the activity of the demonic that is responsible for this illness. And so I suspect that a lot of what we see in the world, whether it's an earthquake or a cancer or something like that, we will discover to actually be surprisingly the realm of demonic and hostile activity.
Yeah, but Phil, that doesn't absolve the problem of evil, right? So God is permitting Satan to do that. I think that would be the atheist argument too.
Well, but it is insofar as it falls now, just like humans, like angels or demons, have been meaningfully delegated this power, and thus we are in the same category. So I think natural evil at that point becomes more similar in its scope to what you described before, where you had said that there was these two categories of evil. That was my only point there.
I would add a quick counterpoint that tectonic activity has been around for a long time, right? So it's like the earth has always been moving. The plates have always been moving. It's just people choose to set up the buildings over there. So I don't necessarily see it as a dynamic thing, at least for earthquakes, right? Because there's been earthquakes all around before modern civilization. But after you set up a house there, of course, now the earthquakes is going to bring down the house on top of you. So
it's one way of... But there could be some trigger to tectonic activities as well. But anyways, yeah, point taken, I guess. Yeah. Sorry, I think Billy.
Yeah, Billy has his hand up.
Yeah. Hey, Finney. Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think of like the classical sufferer in the Old Testament, Job. He experienced some what we would consider natural evil as well, like the windstorm that came and knocked down and killed his some family members, and then even the boils himself. So in that example in the New Testament, that I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as believers. We know that there is demonic activity behind suffering. Again, doesn't solve fault lines. It raises more issues, but it does it is a legitimate explanation for some even natural occurrences that we would see. My question, though, is I think this is, Jaison, you did a phenomenal job. I really enjoyed this. And I think this is one of the questions of our hour. We live in a world of deconstructionism where people are trying to blame God for evil. And this is going to, if we can blame God for evil, we have set ourselves up as our own moral standard. We now, as human beings, can set the right and wrong, and God is the oppressor, and we are the oppressed. And so people feel free to jettison the idea of God and submission to his will. So my question is, are we trying to give answers to things that there are no answers to? And I'll explain what I mean. Job is never given a reason for his suffering, right? He gets an encounter with God, but he's never given an answer. Jesus himself, we know in hindsight, right, in prophecy, why he suffers, but he has that human moment in the garden, and he's wrestling with it, and he gets it. He gets the pain. But I wonder sometimes if we're trying to answer questions that we are forced to trust God with. Like, we cannot know why all these things are happening, and our souls cry out. But at the end of the day, we're only left with faith. So I'm wondering how Christ kind of squares that tension between we don't have the answers we want, but we're forced to trust God. And Christ is our ultimate apologetic for suffering and trust and submitting to the will of God for each one of our lives. So, Jaison, could you kind of expand on that a little bit more and how Christ shows his goodness?
Yeah, and I think that's where I wanted to end, just like picking up my last slide back again. Let me step back a little bit. So I think your point is valid that sometimes we don't have answers. There's a difference between a correct or a convincing answer and some answer, right? So like, for example, or a response, right? So Job got a response. He did not understand the answer to his question, but Job got a response. And in the same way, I feel a response is adequate. Now, depending on which part of the spectrum people are they on the logical problem, on the evidential problem, on the emotional problem of evil, the response changes. And mostly people I think most people struggle with the emotional problem of evil. So it's not so much that they can prove God doesn't exist, but they just dislike what's happening. And the response to that is very pastoral, and it's completely different. And I completely agree with you, and that's why I wanted to end on this slide where we say that we might not understand the cause for evil or why God permits evil, but we can always point and say that God has the ability to redeem good from evil, and the cross in that sense is unique to Christianity. No other religion would kill its God or kill its hero, because it's like antithetical to the way the world operates, and that's why Christianity is countercultural. And that right there is the best example we have, right? He told us empathy. He talked to us about just being in the suffering of other people. So if Jesus wanted, he could just maybe do the Thanos snap and like whatever, second coming, done, everyone's saved, right? But there seems to be a purpose where he chose to, and he did not ignore suffering when he was on earth. One of the few things that he did was preach, go around and healing the sick, and sort of communion with people. So those are all examples, and I think your point is very valid. I feel like as Christians, while apologetic response is one response, I think empathy and love is possibly what Jesus asks us to do. And when Paul asks us to, Peter asks us to be ready to explain the reason for the hope that is in you, it's both, right? One is we explain, well, logically, why do we believe this? But also explain it from the standpoint of we believe in a God who died for us and provides eternal salvation, and we'd like to share that with you. So in my mind, that might not be a satisfactory answer, but that is a necessary response we need to provide to people. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the way I think about it. I think Zachary, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really enjoying this. I really liked Billy's kind of thing that he brought in, but Jaison, am I pronouncing that? I want to make sure.
Yeah,
sorry,
Jaison. Yeah.
Jaison. I also appreciated how you brought in the importance of like creating an answer or having something that meets people where they are. I think the thing that was interesting for me about kind of Billy's question or prompt was when you look at like that passage that Finney brought up in Luke 13, Jesus is asked this question, like in terms of the tower. And when the tower fell, basically like to give an account as to why these people had died. And his response was to repent, calling people, these same like questioners, to actually then repent. Where he didn't, he sidestepped the question altogether. And the same thing in terms of like the end of Job, I don't necessarily see it as, it seems like it's a similar message. It's a message of God's power, God's authority, and God's kingship over his creation to do as he wills. And so I guess at the same time, I do understand your point, Jaison, around the importance of meeting people where they are and creating arguments that help meet them where they are. But at the end of the day, there is a side of like, those arguments are also rooted in all sorts of other reasons and other things preventing them from actually wanting to follow the Lord. So I don't know. Billy's comment really sparked a lot in my head.
So just to clarify, and I think, Billy, you can answer this as well. So if I'm understanding this correctly, are you guys saying that, are you possibly saying that, some people are just not going to get it, so we shouldn't respond at all? Or like we shouldn't even, like if they ask us, well, how can a God exist? You just like walk away? Or is there something, or are you saying we should sort of lead with the Spirit and see what the right response is? Maybe could you elaborate what practically that would look like?
Hey, Jaison. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a lot of breath. I'm biking while I'm listening.
But that doesn't sound safe.
It's fine. So I'm actually a minister. I work with college students in the Philadelphia area. So this is both a theologically like very interesting question, but a very practical one for me too. So I've really grappled with it. To me, it seems like asking the question of why is this happening is a very human response. And we need to have a response to it. We see that in the scripture, right? God gives us the words of lament, of pain, of grief. But it seems to me not the ultimate question. The ultimate question is, can I trust God to redeem this pain? Right? That is the question we have an answer to. We don't have an answer to why is it happening. So I do agree with you. The response, I think Christ is he enters into our suffering and fixes the ultimate suffering so that all temporary suffering has eternal significance now. So that's when I actually talk to somebody who's grieving and going through it, I mean, this is always a personal question. Nobody has gone through a life without pain. So that's how I kind of navigate those waters. But I always try to redirect people to a question that the scripture has given a clear answer to. And a clear answer to in the person of Christ is, yes, I can trust God with this pain and this suffering, even though I don't know why. In some senses, it's happening, whether it's demonic or it's been sovereignly appointed for me to go through this to glorify him. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
I think, in a sense, what both of you are saying is that it's not sort of a one-spot response. It's possibly, whenever such questions come up, it's a call for a relationship, and that's possibly also what Christ points to. Yeah, thanks for that, Billy and Zach. Sean. Yeah, go ahead, Zach. Did you have a point to complete? Oh, I think you dropped off. Sean, did you have your hand raised? Am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes, very well done. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for both that talk and for everyone's comments. I guess I have two questions, and I'll put it to you to answer which of those you prefer. The first question is more micro. It's relating to the point that you mentioned about suffering, which is something I've thought about. You mentioned that if you have suffering plus God is a problem, but suffering without God is suddenly okay for some people. That kind of argument, and I guess it's a question and comment to you to reply to. Is it possible that suffering plus God is actually not really a suffering argument, but a justice argument? meaning in the same way that with a young child, if a young child screams their head off in a room full of people, people just say, "Oh, well, that's a young child. It's just the way that things go." But if an adult person does that, then they have culpability. There's a sense of, well, you should know better. And so that's a comment to you to maybe elaborate and to think about that. And then my second question, you can choose which of those to answer, is related to the discussions that just came before, which is, what is the utility in your experience or in your opinion to discuss these things somewhat in abstract? You had really, nicely said, you're kind of trying to de-Christianize the argument, at least at the outset, which I think, I hear that, and I think that's extremely valid. But I feel like that de-Christianized version of God, sometimes to me, I'm someone who's just getting reacquainted with the Old Testament, and it just seems so wildly impersonal and abstract to the God that we find in the Old Testament and in the New, who is very grounded, and sometimes to our Western sensibilities almost seems ugly, but is nonetheless feels very real and tangible in comparison to sometimes the more abstractified, philosophized God that we can sometimes talk about in apologetics. So, pick up which of those to debate. But yeah, I really would appreciate your comments.
Yeah, no, I think I can answer both maybe very quickly. Starting with the second one, and you probably have to repeat the first one by the time I'm done because I'd forget. But starting with the second one, I think it's a matter of context. So if you're right now in the United States, or from your accent, maybe you were from the UK at some point, you would still, predominantly be surrounded by people who in some way or form are shaped by Western civilization, which is shaped by Christianity, and also have awareness of what the Bible is, who Jesus is, and things like that. And in that context, I would say yes, it doesn't make sense to abstractify it to a point where we're talking about sort of an abstract God. And that's a very good question, and it's just coming to my mind that I'm in India now, and I think most of my calling is in India, and I have to approach this from a very different standpoint, because most people, most of the educated people who would have heard of Jesus Christ as a historical entity, or as a matter of just general knowledge, don't know anything about him, do not accept him as God in India. And even usually the educated class, etc., while they would identify as Hinduism itself is not. I mean, most people do not consider it as a religion, so it's considered more as a philosophy. So it's very easy. So they're practically, in that sense, atheists, who have not heard, who don't really have that much of a context of Christianity. And I think maybe because of that, I chose to frame it this way. Maybe it was more personal reason than anything else. So that's the utility in my mind. Does that answer your question? I would say in America, maybe that this is probably not the way you would. But increasingly, I think the younger generation, Gen Z, millennials, they tend to hold all religions as absurd. So maybe there is some utility. I don't know. Does that answer? Does that answer
It does.
one? Yeah.
It does. Yeah. Thank you very much.
And then the other one, I think, I mean, I'd actually like to poke a little bit on that. You said that, evil existing is only a problem if God exists, and, evil existing is not a problem if God doesn't exist. We can probably appeal to something like, well, you're an adult, you're supposed to behave better, but a child can throw a tantrum. In where this analogy breaks down for me is that, is it the child telling the adult that you can't throw a tantrum, but I can? Because in the way we are formulating this argument, the atheist is the child. If that is so, the child would not have the conception to tell that to the adult. Because if the child had that conception, then he or she is a mature enough child to not throw a tantrum. That's the way I look at this argument. Does that make sense?
It does, but I guess maybe a clarification then would be that in the case, the child would to mother nature.
Sorry, you're breaking up real bad. I couldn't really hear.
Hear me now?
Could you repeat? Yeah, you can. Yeah, repeat that again.
Yeah, I was just saying that the child analogy is analogous to Mother Nature, an impersonal force that, is kind of coming to and fro. You cannot ascribe any morality or justice to it because it's just existing. We would no more charge Mother Nature with being evil than we would a supernova for destroying a whole solar system. It's just what the natural world does. We don't think of the natural world as possessing moral agency, whereas if you bring God into the picture, and I don't agree with this, but I'm saying someone might say bringing God into the picture brings a moral agent, actually not only a moral agent, but the highest moral agent who should know better than to involve evil in the equation.
Yeah, and the possible response to that is, well, maybe God does know better and there is a cause for this evil, but how would you judge whether or not? It's again not a very satisfying from an emotional standpoint, but that becomes the argument. Like, are you the best judge of whether or not God knows better? That becomes the rub. It's not again, it's not a very psychologically or emotionally satisfying answer, but it's enough logically to counter the atheist claim that must mean God doesn't exist. It's not an ontological argument in that sense. But your point is, your point is sort of valid in that sense. I don't see any other hands raised. Finney, you'd mentioned you had like 4 questions. I think you asked only one. I don't know if you wanted to ask more, or do we want to wrap up here? Or does anyone else have a question?
Brenda actually has a question.
Who? Brenda? Yeah, go ahead, Brenda.
Yeah, it's not so much a question. It was just a follow-on comment. That first of all, we're talking about Job as an example. One of the things that's powerful to me about the story of Job is that although the answer that Job gets is not necessarily an intellectually satisfying one, it leads to his worship. It leads to his recognizing his humble state before God and his worshiping and acknowledging God and the truth of who God is. And that just reminds me that as we kind of envision being in tough conversations with people and trying to reason, there's also the reality that the reason by itself will not be enough, and that the person ultimately will need to have a direct encounter with God to change their mind and to ultimately surrender to truth. And so there's a coupling of our being able to reason and offer thoughtful, logical arguments and helpful direction to their thinking, but we also need to couple that with prayer. Jesus says, no one comes to me but unless the Father draws him. So just for that perspective, and I, at the risk of sounding flip, as you were all having that last exchange, I was thinking to myself that I've often thought that any God who has to surrender to my logical standards or that I can fully explain does not actually deserve my worship. and so to me, the fact that there's some mystery and some things we can't fully explain, is actually appropriate for somebody who is God, that I am not God. But that of course is from me who is already a believer. So that would not necessarily satisfy a non-believer. But that was just something that I was thinking to myself when you all said something very similar yourself. So I thought I would throw it out. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Brenda. Reggie, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Brenda just said, and Bill, and what you've been saying about God's redemptive power in evil. I was just thinking of Joseph, Genesis 50 verse 20, where he's like, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Like, just how great God is that he actually extracts good out of the evil. I thought was just, in terms of providing hope in a hopeless world, is really like the beauty of our God.
Yeah, true. Good words. Go ahead, Brenda.
So and that just reminded me, I also wanted to point out the importance of, that at least from the biblical testimony is that God does not take pleasure in our sufferings. He has compassion. He grieves with us. And so even when it is a fruit of the, just the reality of existence, that there is evil and suffering. He doesn't take pleasure in it, in even when he knows that he's going to redeem it. We have the famous example of Jesus weeping after Lazarus's death, and then his not willing to acknowledge that all suffering is a mark of condemnation. So another story similar to what Finney brought up is where Jesus and the disciples come to the blind man, and the disciples say, whose sin caused his blindness? And he very quickly says it wasn't someone's sin, but it was so that God could be glorified. There's the compassionate side of God that's at least testified to in the scripture is something important to factor in.
Yeah, great point. Oh, I quickly wanted to check, has anyone heard an argument which was not covered here, but they found very convincing to answer the problem of evil? Would be great to know if there is.
I'll throw in one that you kind of touched on this, but maybe not with the force that I think, and I'm not faulting you for it because you had a limited time, but I think one of the really interesting points is, insofar as one rejects God because of this problem, the problem of evil, you actually create a far larger problem, which is that now what we call evil is functionally been obliterated. It's an artificial label of certain particles bouncing around in ways that are artificial human constructs, and we no longer have the ability to say that there should be anything. Really only is. And it's a very profound point, and not everyone grasps it fully. But I think it's something that you end up cutting off your nose to spite your face, so to speak. That if one rejects God in all this, well, now you simply deny that evil exists in any sort of objective way, and that everything that should be otherwise can't be otherwise. That you're left with a very reductionistic, materialistic world that is far more unsatisfying than any degree of mystery that you've done a nice job articulating. So I think that's a very important point, is that the atheist actually creates a far larger problem in answering this as he or she does.
Yeah, I was trying to cover that in examining the atheist position. It's like usually their focus is always on saying there is plausible doubt in the theist position, and hence we don't believe. There isn't like a sort of first principles argument on the atheist side. And I think this slide is where I was trying to say that, well, if you don't think God exists, you have no reason to decry evil. I mean, it's just that's the way it is, and hence you cannot answer. You have nothing to console the suffering person. Essentially, I feel it goes back to atheism, sort of going back to the whole talk that Dick, I forget the last name, had on cynicism. Right, it's a cynical position at the end of the day, and that itself has its own circular reasoning. And then even going back to the all good argument, I think the concept of the moral lawgiver. So if there is no moral lawgiver, then how are you cannot decry evil because you don't subscribe to a moral absolute anyways. And if everyone is free to subscribe to their own moral absolute, then you cannot. On what basis are you saying something is evil or bad? So these were the two. But yeah, it's a little because there are too many things to cover. Maybe that didn't come out.
I would agree with Finney, but I just want to add that I feel like it's like the objection by atheists or agnostics. It's not like a lot of them. I don't think a lot of them realize or believes that the alternative way is better, or the alternative belief is so satisfying. It's just that they feel like they can't get over that hump of just how to reconcile the broken, evil world with the concept of good and loving God. They just can't get. They want to. I believe on the inside, but they just can't. So
yeah. And that's where it becomes an emotional problem, actually. It's no longer a logical problem. But it's not clear in people's mind that it's not a logical problem. So it helps to point that out, that what you're saying is you don't like the God who exists. You're not really saying that God, you're not really proving that God doesn't exist. So that's where it, I think, becomes a little bit useful to differentiate the two.
Jaison, just to add in, I think that's what is so powerful about how you just did your presentation where you started and ended. Well, you started by setting up with the story of the concentration camp or the folks that were being hanged, and then you ended with Jesus as being the ultimate sufferer. I think that once you get to that point where you're using, showing the logic and showing that, getting folks to a point where it's just you don't like this sufferer or you don't like this God, I just think it was a very well done and very powerful way to then show them, well, he's a God that suffers with us, or that has suffered with us. So well done there.
Thanks.
I agree.
Oh, go ahead, Vinny.
Well, I was going to just ask a couple of quick questions. By the way, if anybody needs to go, feel free. This is all just this is extra time here. And thank you, Jason, for being generous with your time. You're in India, so it's very late there right now. What is it, 11 o'clock at night? Something like that.
Yeah, 10:30. Yeah, go ahead. No
Okay.
problem.
So I completely agree with what Zach said. I thought that was actually one of the strongest parts of your presentation, was how you framed the talk there. This is more for the fact that hopefully we'll get this up on YouTube. I would love if you could just maybe restate in very simple terms. You had two slides. One was there is a strong case against the logical problem, and then the evidential problem is also subjectively answerable. I thought those were quite complex slides, and I think many people may not have followed it. So if you could just state in a very simple way, as simply as you can, the resolution there, that'd be great.
For the logical and the evidential problem?
Yeah, just on both of those slides, you had challenging the assumptions. P1 through P6 invalidates the atheist assumptions. My suspicion is that not everyone followed your logic there. So if you could just, like I said, not necessarily walk through the slide, but just state it as simply as you can.
Yeah. So the logical problem says that it is impossible for God and evil to exist, but there is actually no logical contradiction between, like, prima facie, like, it's not like, well, it's a square and a circle together. There is no contradiction between God and evil, in a sense, unless there are certain assumptions which we put in, which is to say that an all-powerful God can create any world he wants. Basically, he can do anything, can do logical contradictions, and an all-loving God will always choose a world without suffering. So basically what we debunked in the logical problem is that, well, these two things are not the way we define God. Like, God holds to certain logical consistencies, and God, while all loving, allows for pain because he wants human beings to grow, or some pain is necessary and some suffering is necessary. So when those two arguments fall off, it's not impossible that God would allow evil. And hence the logical problem that it is impossible that God and evil can coexist sort of falls off. It's not impossible. Then we have to come to the question of whether or not it is improbable. Now, improbability is, we have to sort of appeal to the fact that, well, whether or not it is improbable that God can allow evil and that he is justified in allowing evil, that's not something for finite human beings to answer. So that's where we come to, how much understanding humans are capable of. So we say that we are not the best judge. And if that's not a convincing answer, we also say that, well, because if the question is about improbability, then let's look at other evidence also for God and not only use this evil as an evidence for non-existence of God. And then there is so much evidence of, like, good, beauty, and truth in the world. How would you explain that? It is better explained with the presence or with the existence of God. So the question of improbability, the way to answer that would be, well, no, I mean, look at the world, there is suffering, but it is probable that God allows some of the suffering with good cause, or all of the suffering with good cause, or that he can redeem suffering even if it doesn't have a good cause today. And look at the strength of the other evidence, which is all the good, the truth, and the beauty in the world. And then it stands to reason that, yes, it is probable that God exists and he allows for the suffering that is in the world.
Thanks. That's great. Fred, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah, a couple of things. So again, I was reading that History of Christianity book, and talked about the Age of Enlightenment. And when I was thinking about the atheist's view, the alternative view, which we all agree is really not satisfying. Even atheists, modern atheists themselves understand this. But I think during the times of Enlightenment, what was popular was theism. So you still believe there's a God. And you still believe, I think, that we are called to be good. There's good and evil, and we're called to be good. But you kind of just believe that God kind of created the world with its natural laws and kind of just left it as it is, right? He's not totally involved. At the end, I think that didn't really work out either because, again, that's not satisfying. But I think that could also potentially be a view held by some people, even if they may not know it very consciously. That's a view. It's like, okay, so that view, because that view of reality, maybe it's easier to explain the concept of evil and brokenness. The other thing I just want to quickly add is this. I grew up in China, in a country that's not in the West, and I think a lot of developing countries that were subject to the Western colonial powers during the early 20th century, often really much worship and admire the scientific developments that happen in the West, and they view as science and rationality is the way out of suffering. So I found myself sometimes wondering, hey, Jesus came and he's God, he knows everything. Why didn't he teach us about germ theory? Millions of people died before modern medicine from all these preventable diseases, right? Just letting us know how the Black Death was spread would save so many people. And also, my example with earthquakes, if he only taught us how to build houses better and not in other places, and how to construct this well and do that well, we could have saved so many people during the history and so many sufferings during the history of humanity. I'm not talking about the Nazis and all the evil people. I'm talking about just these accidents that can happen. You just need to know better, right? But then I thought about how Jesus only walked on this earth for 33 years. His ministry is only 3 years long, and I think he chose to spend the 3 years of his ministry talking about the really important stuff, which is eternal life. And I'm like, okay, so I feel like I realized that for God, our present comfort or even safety is not the most important thing. It is about eternity. It is about our soul. That is the most important thing to him. And that should affect how I view my life and the values that I espouse in my life as well. Obviously not to say we shouldn't care for people, right? Jesus fed people and healed people. But so that was a big realization on my part too. So
I think that is fundamentally that's a great point, and that is fundamentally what I was hoping to come at the last slide and say that, well, let's get out of our perception of what needs to happen and what's good and all those kind of things, and then really look at the example that God. I think Finney at one point really in one of his sermons or talks, I remember, has mentioned this, that we try to fit Jesus into our understanding of God. That's not possible. Actually, we have to fit our understanding of God based on what Jesus has shown or told us. That's the best revelation we have. And I think the way you thought about it in terms of, well, what did Jesus spend his limited 3 years ministry doing? And that gives us a very clear indication of what's the most important thing he wants us to focus on. Yeah, thanks for that, Fred. And I think that's a good note. That's a good note as any to maybe end the talk for today. We're already over time. Thank you so much, everyone, for chiming in and for the lively discussion. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Take care. Have a great weekend.